The best advice you'll get from me today is this one. Every time you use auto settings to set your exposure, you're really limiting your camera to only about 50 to 70% of its full potential. So don't even bother buying an expensive new camera to improve your videos if that's how you intend to use it. But if you're ready to learn how to get much better footage than ever before out of your budget camera by changing 3 simple settings manually, then let me teach you exactly how to do that in this video. Hey guys, my name is E. I'm a professional sports videographer with experience in the NBA, the NHL, the UFC, and the NFL. And the purpose of my YouTube channel is to give you the tools and knowledge necessary to jumpstart your very own sports videography career. And today I want to achieve that by teaching you how to properly expose for sports using your camera's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, otherwise known as the exposure triangle. And don't worry if you typically shoot in automatic mode and the idea of having like 3 settings in manual mode while shooting kind of scares you, because in reality, 2 of those settings are more of a set and forget type of thing, and it's only the 3rd one that you'll probably need to adjust depending on how your lighting conditions are changing. All right, so let's get into it. Before playing with your exposure settings, you need to first set your frame rate. Most people film sports at 60 frames per second, so for the purpose of this video, that's what I'm gonna set mine at today. Then I'm gonna set my first exposure setting, which is my shutter speed. And because I'm filming at a 60 frames per second frame rate, my shutter speed can be slower than 1/120. Otherwise, there would be way too much motion blur. And since I'm filming sports at a high frame rate and there is a lot more movement or motion than in any other type of videography, I actually recommend a slightly faster shutter speed to remove even more motion blur. So for a 60 frames per second frame rate, I personally like a 1/250 shutter speed. And just in case you're wondering, here are the shutter speeds that I recommend for each frame rate. The next exposure setting to adjust is the aperture. Most people like to keep it as low as possible to get nice blurry backgrounds. Typically on a high-end zoom lens, that means f2.8. But I like to keep it at f4 because it is slightly sharper and it gets more players in focus simultaneously. By the way, for more details about aperture in the context of a sporting event, simply watch the video I made on the topic, which I'll put a link to in the description. But FYI, if you are using a budget lens with a variable aperture which goes up and down as you zoom in and out, I recommend setting your aperture to the highest value of your lens so that the aperture remains constant even when you're zooming. Otherwise, as you zoom in and out and the aperture of your lens changes, the exposure or brightness of your shot will change as well. So basically, if your lens is an f3.5 to 6.3, for example, I recommend setting your aperture to f6.3. That way it will remain at 6.3 no matter what you do and won't affect your exposure at all. All right, so now that we know which shutter speed and aperture to use, next up is the ISO. But first, a quick message from my favorite sponsor. Attention sports videographers. I recently decided to combine all my sports digital assets into one fully loaded solution. So we're talking about my sports sound effects pack, my sports LUT pack, my impact essentials, and my markers and scribbles, all of that into one ultimate sports editing bundle. This complete toolkit has everything you need to create epic sports videos that will wow your audience and set your work apart. There's 12 LUTs built specifically for various sports scenarios, over 700 sports sound effects, and over 375 sports motion graphics and animations that can be easily integrated into your videos to make every highlight reel unforgettable. All of that for a heavily reduced price. Head to BeyondTheGame.tv right now and pick up the most complete sports editing toolkit on the market. Alright, so now that our shutter speed is set to 1/250 and our aperture is set to f4, the only setting left to play with is the ISO. And I say play on purpose because that's the only setting that I can't give you an exact value for, because it's gonna depend on your lighting conditions. So obviously you wanna keep it as low as possible, because the higher you go with the ISO, the more noise or grain you will introduce in your image. But ultimately, you need to go high enough for your image to look properly exposed. One way to monitor your exposure is to look at the exposure metering and try to keep it slightly above 0. But that can vary from one picture profile to the next. For example, in S-Log3, it is recommended to keep it between 1.3 and 1.7. Another way to monitor your exposure is to use zebras. I set mine at 90% and adjust my ISO to see just a little bit of zebras on the brightest spots of my image. But above all monitoring methods, what I trust most of all is my own opinion. By looking at my screen, I can easily tell if something looks too dark or too bright, especially if I'm using a field monitor. And that's not experience talking, it's just common sense. I'm sure you've been in situations where the image looked a bit too dark or a bit too bright while filming, but you hope that it would somehow look better on your computer. And I'm pretty sure that in the end, it did not. So trust yourself, trust your instincts, because if it doesn't look good to you in camera, it's probably not gonna look much better once the footage comes out of the camera. By the way, I almost forgot to mention that if you're filming outdoors in broad daylight and even the lowest ISO setting still looks way overexposed, that's because you should always use a variable ND filter when filming in those conditions. A variable ND filter will act as sunglasses for your lens and will allow you to use the right exposure settings in camera. And for a more detailed explanation about variable ND filters and how they work, simply watch the video appearing on your screen right now. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.